It is September 21st, 2022, 5 o'clock at City Hall. We are in the council chambers regarding a special city council meeting regarding budgets. Clerk, please take the roll call.
Tom Kelly. Stephen Jopek. Eileen Daniel. Karen Michalowski.
Here.
Gerald Anderson.
Here.
Thomas Barnett.
Here.
David Holt. Leanne Felton.
Here.
Chris Hannes.
Here, we do have quorum. Pledge of allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Okay. Anyone for public comment? Okay. Not seeing anyone for public comment. Moving on to new business. City budget and all the fun and excitement it entails. I refer to Zach.
All right, so in the budget timeline you all saw at a previous council meeting, we're in keeping with that order generally in terms of the departments and the budgets you'll see tonight. We've got a series of budget meetings, the next one coming up next week at 5 p.m. with a council meeting to follow at 6 p.m. So as to not confuse too much of the time and to also make good use of your ability to show up here on a single night. So thanks for those of you that could be here tonight, and hopefully those that can't be here can catch the recording. As with previous budget cycles, or at least the last two that I've been a part of, and for those of you that had been a part of council at least for that same period of time, the requests you'll see tonight are really that, and from a department standpoint, requests. We're too early in the budget process in some respects as it relates to the revenue side, and that's why that appears later, to really know where our budget can bear all the requests that are submitted on behalf of department heads to administration. So as we progress through the process, you'll see how the budget will materialize in more of a final format, and then we'll identify for your benefit what those changes were to the requests that were submitted to the city. So want to give Wendy a great deal of credit, because not only is it you can't use the analogy of second or third checking this kind of work, because these numbers do change and evolve, particularly as we get estimates from state agencies in terms of revenues, but also the final numbers, and there's just a bunch of dynamics, as well as kudos to the new staff that are going through this process for the first time, both with our budgeting tool as well as learning something very early in many of their roles. So it's taken a great deal of patience for everybody, and want to just give them all a thank you for that. So the first budget tonight is the airport. And Matthew and Angie are here. If there's any, if they want to come to the podium, if there's any questions. As you'll see in front of you in the packet is the budget comparisons, revenue being at the top part of that, and then the expense being at the bottom. Their subsidy that is being requested of the city is unchanged, and as you'll see, the request mirrors the county's subsidy. So I would allow Matthew any additional comments. Given they're governed by the Airport Commission, I presume their commission has at least prepared or overseen this budget, or made a formal action to request it of the city, but I'll let Matthew speak. And just hit the microphone, if you could just kick that on. It's, nope.
It's got to be
there
red.
you go.
Okay, gotcha. I thought red was off. I apologize. So yes, the Airport Authority has approved this budget. I want to extend our gratitude for the opportunity to come before you and justify or validate our request and answer any questions you may have. I also wish to extend a copious amount of gratitude to Angela Fry, our Assistant Director. She was the one who put this together, and she was an integral part of the process and has done an outstanding job. As you see line item by line item, and we can delve as far into it as you wish, a lot of things that we're all contending with right now are reflected in our budget in terms of expenses. Insurance has gone up quite a bit. Fuel, obviously, which we depend heavily upon for our operation, has gone up quite a bit. And we, as Zach said, for about the past, I believe, and Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, 8 years, we have not asked for an increase in our budget. So with the inflationary pressure, we've, philosophically, we've asked more from our users and tenants in order to offset the additional expenses we've incurred. And just briefly, capital improvements, like Zach said, the relationship between the city and the county and our budget, grants are predicated on an equal contribution between city and county for the airport. And in 2017, these are federal and state grants. We received $775,000 worth of grants. 2019, it was $3.8 million. 2022 was $4.45 million. And for 23, we have $9.78 million programmed from the FAA and the state. So I think you're getting a pretty good return on your investment. But again, be happy to answer any questions you may have. I know we want to be expeditious about this, so I'll limit my comments.
All right, seeing no questions at this time, obviously alderpersons can reach out to you at the airport, and I understand that at some point wanting to get the full council out there
Please.
is something that is desired, so
Absolutely.
stay tuned for that, I guess.
Well, thank you all very much again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The next page, getting into more of the city-controlled operations, mayor, council, and attorney legal. You'll see attorney legal appear in a number of areas throughout the budget as a reminder, and that's partially due to the government accounting standards that we follow. The kind of long and short of this page here is you'll find in the on every budget, as with in the past, under the 2022 number, the projected total as well as the budget for 2022 to the right, and then the request for 2023. So by and large, we're projecting a bit of a, being under budget for this budget, and that request for 2023 would follow more in line with what the expenditures actually are projected for this year. No changes proposed to your per diem. That would be something you'd have to decide if you'd like to do that. Yeah, Gerald? If you want to hit your microphone just so the recording can pick you up.
Any general reason you can give as to why expenditures were lower?
A couple of areas, I think, let me just find where they were. I didn't mark them on this
The main
copy.
one would be the attorney, legal fees.
Yeah, the legal fees, the classification of where legal fees generally were. Council continues to receive a fair amount of legal utilization, though we dropped that down in part because we're not bargaining next year. So there'll be a projected savings there, or a projected less underutilization of legal services. Am I missing any other? We had a small and contingency in the mayor. Previously, that's $1,000. Any other questions in that budget? Otherwise, we'll go to the next page. These are kind of small, so I'm going to zoom in here. So the administration budget is really broken out into 4 budgets. The administration, which accounts for the administrator as well as human resources, in the top section. The second section is information technology. Third section being insurance, and then economic development, and then more of a catch-all, which is historically been transfer to special revenue funds for property acquisition and improvements. Starting at the administration level, the one notable thing on the salaries question that might come up, looking at budget to what the request is for next year. When we passed last year's budget, we had a different step in grade for the HR position. And if there's further question on the exact detail, we can pull that up. But that's one component. And Wendy, if you had anything more to.
We also have our administrative assistant helping with our Laserfish program is included in this salaries line item.
And she's been essentially a temp or an LTE, so non-benefits eligible position.
Can you explain more about the professional services and how that number is so volatile in the last couple of years?
Yeah, the 2022 year, I believe that's where, when I was consulting, where those were being charged. The previous administrator also had used JSD Professional Services for some of the park planning. I know that came out of there. And without really anything planned, though, not really being able to cast a crystal ball on aspects of administration for next year, reserving some dollars there for professional services would enable the administrator to propose special projects that might require external services, that type of thing. Yes, Tom.
Okay, just because that $10,000, for example, is going to be in the budget, you don't have to spend it.
As with every line item, yeah, that you find throughout the budget. Though, what warrants council approval, generally, we have a procurement policy, a purchasing policy that they'd have to comply with. So the question is whether or not we'd have to spend that line item, but no.
And then I just wanted to point out too, in that professional services, for the June year to date, it was 18,000, and we're saying the projected by year end is only 11,000. It's because we were accumulating the professional fees for the TIDS 11 and 12 there until we got approval to create it, and then I reallocated those expenses.
One area that you also find is in recruitment. We were using a platform called Indeed. You probably have seen that advertised on TV or something, but we've since decided to forego that. It was a very expensive tool that didn't seem to reap any additional rewards, so hoping that our recruitment budget can get back to a much more reasonable number. We don't do a lot of paid advertising, but there are some positions that do warrant some paid exposure. Not that we go in the newspaper with these generally anymore, but something of that sort. And then in the contingency, you'll see that there was a reevaluation market adjustment. Our contract assessor has advised us with some information that we really should consider updating our property records throughout the city. It's been a considerable amount of time since that's occurred. In fact, our assessor is unsure if that actually has ever occurred. So right now, the assessor's working a lot off of sales activity, which is common. Though if there's not a lot of sales activity for a long period of time, there's disproportionate or inequities around the assessment ratio. And the state also, the Department of Revenue, issues an annual report, of which Rhinelander next year will be in its first year of being out of compliance. And it's got a number of years to remain out of compliance before it has to do something. But it'd be an item that I would recommend that the council get a presentation from our assessor on, just to get more information about that effort, how that, because ultimately the equalization and the assessment of property across the tax base should be equal. I mean, it should be equitable. But whether or not there's any true benefits or what benefits to the city there might be is something to be discussed. It's a very heavy lift. I didn't budget anything presently in there without having you all have more information on that. But I would recommend it be considered further. You could use the ARPA money as a funding source if you didn't want to use taxpayer dollars to fund that effort.
Explain more about being out of compliance and what's the state process and how long that works.
Yeah, it takes it by classification. So we've got residential, commercial, and industrial classes of property in the city. And, there's been a lot of sales activity in residential and commercial. The out of compliance is a 10% plus or minus. So it's 110%. You're either 110% above the fair market value, or you're 10% below. So there's a 20%, I guess, swing. And if you're out of compliance for consecutive years, I believe it's 4, then the state will come in and do your revaluation for you at a cost of, say, at least twice of what the cost would be. So it's much better to kind of do it on your own basis versus waiting for that to occur, both from a financial standpoint and a work product. We want to own our assessment records, and right now, if our assessment records do not exist, or they're only existing because of sales activity, our data set is very poor. And so the assessor occasionally has challenges of applying an assessment value, especially in sales that are probably not arm's length transactions. Can they throw a sale of a property out because it was a a close link transaction. There's some questions there, but that would be something we should do a standalone presentation at a future meeting for the assessor to, or the assessment firm, I should say. It would be actually somebody different than our assessor, likely, that would be doing it, but somebody from their firm. And they do book out probably a year in advance, so they're booking well into next year for revaluations. It would likely take two assessment cycles for that to be in effect. So it wouldn't take effect next year if people had revaluations. It may not even take effect for the following assessment year. So that's an item I'll reserve as kind of a discussion, but Gerald, yeah, go ahead.
So there's no plan at this time to get reassessment done?
Right. We allocated, it's something that we should be allocating some money over time to do, because our budget just generally can't support spikes in that cost. So that money is currently sitting in the special projects fund, I believe, or it's segregated in any case, to be utilized for that. But right now there is no commitment of the city to do it. It's just to continue with our existing assessment practices.
What do you think that's going to cost when the time comes?
We have a proposal. I think it's 160,000, so we're about 100,000 short of what we'd need. Yeah. And there's also a potential that personal property tax will be repealed by the state. The governor and the legislature both decided to do that, but didn't agree how and when. So that could be a small cost savings to exclude personal property tax at that point in time. Any other questions? Yep, Gerald.
The line for economic development,
Yeah,
how is that spent?
I'll go through that. Yeah, and I'll take the question now. That's fine. We had previously been funding them $26,000. We agreed last year to fund them additional $4,000 for some special attention and effort in the area of, I think, hotel and some other things. And so we determined at this time that there aren't any special known projects for that work, though we do need to continue to keep them focused on priorities for the city of Rhinelander, because it's no small sum of change that we advance on to them for their work. Because
This is the Economic Development Commission?
Oneida County Economic Development Corporation. So that's a joint city-county effort. And there's some private funding in there, but the city and the county, I believe, fund that the same, similarly to the...
Based on our last year's contributions, what can you say our reward was by giving them $30,000?
That's a tough thing to evaluate because you're paying for salaries. What fruits do you have for your efforts? I would say the city has taken on a tremendous amount of its economic development effort, and partially because projects and developers are coming to the city. We're creating TIF districts. We're doing plan review at the staff level across the departments. We took on the housing study, did the hotel study. All those efforts were done by the city, not by OCEDC. Though OCEDC does have somewhat of a relationship in courting some of those developers or discussing things like housing projects with others. So in terms of a return on investment in a traditional sense, it'd be very difficult for me to say that the city got a direct $30,000 return. And that's partially why we're recommending a reduction back to the previous funding level.
Have you known of any other cities to do this as an incentive, where they bring in a housing development, you get so much for economic development, kind of is more of a pay-as-you-go based on what they are providing for the city versus the county?
More of an incentive base. I think it could work in some limited instances. Getting the financing, and a lot of that is so much is on the bank side or financing side, not on the OCEDC side. Though I think there are, like contracting with a chamber for services or another nonprofit, prescribing some of those in a contract is not out of the norm for the city with some of our relationships, and that could be something we could, with direction and input, we could negotiate that with OCEDC for next year.
Do you think it'd be better just to hire someone part-time for $30,000 that's a direct report of the city that could then work with the county to do grant writing for economic development, as well as just have the purpose of economic development for the city limits versus the county as a whole?
It's definitely a solid option. I would have to think if it would be a better option. The city would have more direct authority and control over how the time is spent. So yeah, I think in that regard you would have some benefits Right now, OCDC is governed by a board. The city has multiple representatives on that board. I think 3 seats. They moved to a quarterly meeting model, which I don't believe has necessarily given it enough direction and oversight. It's something that probably warrants a more regular meeting schedule. But those would be things if we continued to work with them directly or decided to reallocate these monies would need some additional fleshing out. But all really good considerations. Insurance, looking at a couple of increases. The 7% for general property insurance is due to a general increase in values of property. Our insurance carrier is proposing that 7% across the board, and then the 3% in the other categories there. And we don't have final numbers on insurance, so that's one that once we get our renewal process, that we'll have firm numbers on that one. We'll move to the clerk. He's slashed his budget this year. No elections next year. No, there's fewer elections next year, so you'll see that there's a reduction both in the request for there, and that's consistent with previous years where there were fewer elections. Any other noteworthy items, Austin, that you'd like to propose there? Austin's not taking on any bad debt and illegal tax expense, but there are occasions where we have to charge things there, so we've retained that for that purpose. Wendy could maybe speak to some more of the historical uses if the question comes up, or we can give you more information on that later.
Why do we project overtime to be about half for that department?
Overtime?
Yeah, you'll see in the elections that there won't be, and certainly in that category, that there are fewer elections would warrant just fewer hours.
And much lower turnout elections as well, so.
I'm not sure why this is not zooming out, but I don't know. Is anybody actually looking at the screen? I'll stop playing with it. Thomas? Okay. Let me just see if I can zoom out. There we go. Any other questions on elections? Finance treasurer is the next one here. Allow Wendy to speak to any noteworthy items in her budget.
It's pretty much just status quo. Probably the big item besides salaries in this budget is just for the auditors. But because we have low staffing, I don't see where we can get away from our auditors. Like reducing their services, they provide a lot of service to us.
The one thing we've talked about in the audit space is whether or not it makes sense to go out to RFP as our procurement policy. And I think at some point in the next coming year or two, it might make sense to do so, though there's a carrying cost of new auditors, new overhead, and getting them familiar with the city's accounting practices. So I would just make that caveat known. The debt service is pretty straightforward. Next year is a borrowing year for the city, so we're currently working through, as we get through the departmental requests, also formulating a list of what would constitute the borrowing for next year, and we're proposing the same borrowing that we've done in the same sequence of the every other year rotation. But you'll also see the other debt that's outstanding here. If you recall, we refinanced a number of issuance, so those will drop off as time goes on. The good thing is we did that at a very lucrative or advantageous time, so save some interest costs certainly.
And the first payment on the borrowing that we do in 2023 won't be until 24, so that's why it's not included in here.
CDBG revolving loan fund. This is the housing assistance program, completely administered by a third party. We budget annually for a handful of projects, though it's really just an estimate. There's not much more science to this than just projecting that there will be some requests. You can see the fund balance that's available outstanding, projected at the end of the year is almost $300,000 in the bottom left corner. So there's definitely monies available in that program. We've pushed it on a handful of occasions on social media as well as in utility bills. I would stress that we have a fair amount of qualifying people in Rhinelander for new furnaces, windows, siding. They don't have to be homeowners. They can also be landlords. So if for qualifying individuals, of course, I think they track tenant income thresholds in that program, but definitely one to keep top of mind if you encounter residents, constituents in your neighborhoods that might need some assistance, especially as we have a new code enforcement officer out there in the neighborhoods that's making a lot of contact with individuals. Having this program available will be of benefit, though like any other federal CDBG program, it comes with a fair amount of not friendly strings.
Besides interest and repayment of loans, how do we acquire funds? Is that just something we got to transfer in if needed, or is it through the government?
Yeah, we could transfer our own money in. I think this could be a program that could probably receive the ARPA money just because housing is called out in there. Otherwise, we could apply for another grant from the state, the Department of Administration, to replenish it. Though I think if they look at this, they see fund balance, they probably would be less than likely to fund it. But as we get a lot more activity, it'll be one to keep an eye on. And a lot of these get satisfied only upon sale of homes. And the clerk probably gets served by process served every other week, it seems, in some instances of bankruptcies and foreclosures. Because a lot of these homes, individuals that have qualifying income can't afford necessarily to make the payments sometimes, or it's a bankruptcy or a death, and we've got to take a small write-off. So that's also a pressure that this program faces, that if the home doesn't sell, if we're too late in the collection process, it's difficult to recover that.
If the person qualifies from an income point of view, would this work for hooking up to utilities such as water or sewage?
I believe so. I believe there's a utility thing in there. We had a resident that had an issue, and I thought we sent them the paperwork. It's on the city's website. I will just clarify that, so I don't want to speak too confidently that it would be funded. Moving to downtown works, probably the lesser known aspect of the city's budget, probably next to the CDBG revolving loan fund. This is a program that has been in existence for a while. I do have at least one. I've actively been talking with another person who ended up selling their building, but the buyer of that building is actively considering an application. And we've got a small group we've got a committee essentially that would be reviewing those requests. And this had historically been funded with Downtown Rhinelander, Inc., the Bid District, City of Rhinelander, and the Cleary Foundation. So $193,000 is in there available to lend.
I'm assuming the loan is just based on holdover from not doing the loan this year?
Yeah, right. There hasn't been any.
We just budget
some
for
payoffs.
four loans.
Oh.
We haven't had a loan.
And then
in
you'll see some
22.
repayments in there too. Room tax, this remains somewhat of a work in progress just as we try to get more information, more numbers, some high level pieces. The first line item there, we're projecting that we'll conservatively receive $225,000 in room tax collection, though with at least one new hotel opening in the first quarter or second quarter of next year, as well as another shortly thereafter. It'll remain to be seen what cannibalization or new room tax is collected. I can confidently say there will be a bump. So we decided to request or budget essentially what the projected actual will be for this year. In any case, the city retains 30% designated for its purposes, which currently its purposes designated by the council are the historical complex, fireworks, and then had been lifeguards in the past at Hodag Park Beach. But this year we didn't have any staff, and frankly the feedback had been just as consistent that it's not an expenditure we're proposing to take on. The $35,000 is a slight bump to the fireworks cost, but also a plan to hold a 4th of July event at the Hodag Park stage. So it would be more of a 4th of July celebration with an enhanced fireworks show. But more to come on this budget. It gives you a sense that fund is carrying about $100,000 in available surplus that's been really undesignated. We've long talked about, at least at the room tax level, purchasing a billboard, and we've now come to terms with acceptance on that, so we'll get this updated to reflect the purchase of that billboard once we get the final details worked out.
Another source of income would be, we approved one VRBO short-term rental in the city, and I believe we have 3 more coming at our next planning meeting. So that'd be yet another way for us to collect funds for true room tax. So that's another reason why we thought the revenue would increase.
And one other note, we've got the grants/donations to chamber. As per the ordinance change on room tax, know that really is the 70% that's retained for tourism, marketing, and promotion. So it's not a grant to the chamber necessarily, it's to the commission or committee that's reviewing that activity. Yes, Joe.
Could you explain the transfer to historical complex?
Well, we'll go right to the next page. So the next page is the Pioneer Park Historical Complex. It's been the practice, at least the last 3 or so years, that the museum staff are paid. They used to be volunteers previously, but then they got put on the payroll. The expense you'll see is in the salaries and the associated expenses with operating it below the space, or the second half of that. As with the other budgets, the expenses are at the bottom. And so the room tax is funding 100% of the museum operations, though we've had some discussion with them as they've brought a credit card machine online that they probably should think about starting to take online donations, and right now they're not. And they're not taking donations at the register either. It's all cash. And so I think there's opportunities there as they have significant visitor activity. QR codes are so common today to donate, when you're leaving a museum and such. So that could be an opportunity to capture more income. But ultimately, the council would reserve the right to make any modifications, given this is the 30% that the city designates.
Can you explain the gift shop merchandise, why that's such a volatile, and it seemed like we're way over budget this year?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we did discuss that with them, that it appeared that they were buying a lot more inventory than they were actually selling, and that was true. And some of the logic in there was to pre-purchase inventory because it could be bought at a discount. And we had a discussion that their request should also follow that, which we haven't fully, I don't think we actually got the final numbers from Kerry on that, as to really what is he going to be purchasing or proposing to be purchasing next year. If you're buying 2 years of inventory, you don't buy 3 years of inventory, then you reduce that amount. So that's something that he'll head into the year with a lot more inventory on hand. And if he's not projecting to sell all that inventory, he probably shouldn't be buying another year's worth of inventory, if that makes sense.
But according to the way we do the accounting for this, after the season is closed and he's counted his inventory and given me the numbers, then I make a journal entry that reduces the expenditure for 22 and puts it into an inventory account, and then we update the numbers at the end of each season. So this 14,500 could be reduced at the end of the year.
So being in retail management way too long, cost of goods sold for merchandise is always a tricky subject. Have we explored options from, let's say, T-shirts, hoodies, stuff that you have to order so many and we always run out of the large, extra large versus the triple small and the triple L? Have we explored options where it'd be more, we have a display and then you pay and we ship it to you right from vendor, so we're not sitting on a couple $1,000s of merchandise hoping someone of the right size shows up?
Yeah, a little more just in time. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we encouraged Kerry to expand some knowledge base upon some alternatives to just buying inventory and hoping that, it sells, or having to maybe clearance it. We discussed that with him, and we also discussed that with Jeremy, who technically Carrie reports to, as an opportunity to continue to explore better inventory management, as well as the whole, at some point, raising more revenue and income should be a goal. And, because our costs and needs may change, and he can't necessarily count on room tax every year 100% to fund the operations. So it'd be good for him to accrue a little bit of a fund balance as a cushion over time. Tom?
The Pioneer Park Historical Complex, that's a city-owned thing, right?
Correct. Yep. The assets are all city-owned. Yep.
So why are we telling him that he's got to raise money for a city-owned museum?
It's no different than our other parks discussions when we talk about we'll get into the playground equipment and the other budgets, that we always have either grants that we receive or budget income or any sort of, they can, obviously he's selling inventory, that he should consider alternative funding sources and revenue, and not to rely on room tax as a funding source.
No different than we do to our police, fire, city administrator, clerk,
Yeah.
everyone else.
They all have to raise their own money?
No, but they have to push to find ways of new revenue,
Yeah.
through Badger Book grants, through Public Works. As a city employee, you got to be fiscally responsible. And I think we should treat everyone fairly in that, where if you're a department head or employee of a department, you should be looking ways to generate revenue.
I
it's
think he demonstrated that when he came to me not too long ago, telling me what a great thing a credit card machine would be, met with lots of restriction and pushback to even get that. But with my pushing it forward, he finally was able to get it. So I believe it was one of the first things we even talked about when you first started.
Right.
So, sound like he's not trying to find new ways of doing this. Some things are a lot more restrictive than other departments. I will say that as a city-owned museum, if they're struggling to find volunteers to even work, and then we're going to pull the rug out from under them by not paying employees to work there, that's kind of dumb. It's a city-owned thing.
I think you misheard me. I stated that they previously were volunteers and now they're being paid.
I thought I heard you say that that was an option to get just volunteers.
So I would refer to 210-551-200, which is the salaries. There is no change in salaries for that department. Right. So funding for salaries.
I'm not talking this year. I thought I understood it as that's an option on the table for the future.
I think what Zach was referring to is funding source as an option.
Yeah.
If it's a room tax, general fund, or increased revenue through the department itself.
Okay.
So-
Wendy can speak to maybe the year 2018, 2017, when we switched over from volunteer to paid, because it had been a practice
They
at
have
the
been paid since before 2013.
2013. Okay.
Yeah, but I believe that they got just a little bit of a tiny increase in pay at one of those years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think administration of a museum can be done half a dozen different ways, right? And the point that I'm making is, like every department, and I think that was eloquently stated, in the $50,000 that they got for the railroad restoration, to solicit the community for gifts to make renovations and improvements is no different across the city. And we're giving him positive, constructive feedback as to ways he should and could be doing that.
And with accepting credit cards, we're just suggesting further exploring ways of getting donations with that.
Is it kind of like the Roundup program kind of a thing, where if your total's 1505,
Yeah.
you pay 1617? Is that kind of the concept you're thinking?
Yeah, I think the Square card reader could feature some options like that. Yeah,
Okay.
they're not currently doing that. Everything they get for donations, aside from like a capital project at the foundation, would be through cash boxes at the door. And I don't know if you're like me, I don't carry cash or change in my pocket, but I would be happy to give a $5 donation via QR code or something.
A lot of restaurants and other businesses are on their credit card machines. They're adding a fee for you to use your credit card. Okay, so it might 1 or 2%, so you could make an income there. Everybody use a credit card.
Yeah.
They pay $1.50 or $2.
Yeah, that's
For the
another great
privilege of
for cost
using-
recovery, right? Yeah, because every time they swipe the card, they're losing some sort of profit off
For
their
the
item.
privilege of using that card.
Yeah, that's a
Because you have to
great
pay,
mention.
you know.
All right, we're going to roll into parks. And Jeremy, unfortunately, can't be here today. He's off, but you'll see a number of changes there as it relates to some of the capital items at the bottom. But the projected budget and his actual budget, you'll find are in line. There's a significant increase shown here currently in his request. Whether we can fund it from the operations or if we have to go to the borrowing still is undetermined finally, but it looks as if we might be able to achieve some of these items in the operating budget. They use what's called a toolcat to plow or sweep sidewalks and such in the wintertime. It's a very versatile piece of equipment that they also make parks improvements and parks maintenance activities. So we've got one on the rotation for replacement. He'd likely trade in and receive a trade-in value for his existing one. So that's the lower right corner. And then he's also requesting a replacement vehicle. You'll find this in at least one other department, two other departments. And this will be an item that will be beneficial wherever we end up with the financing of it, because we're really short one vehicle in our fleet right now in the inspection office for our code enforcement officer to make their rounds throughout the city. So the practice generally is to keep whatever the either highest value, maybe even average value vehicle within our fleet.
I will say, I believe it is key to have that position have its own vehicle, just based on they tend to ruffle some feathers for people, and having them use their personal vehicle could lead to damage. So I think that is definitely a position no different than like a police officer where a city vehicle is key, I
Right.
think. True. No, but, you know, I prefer to have eggs flung at a city vehicle than my personal, if I was a code enforcer. Just me personally, so.
And then under urban forestry, one of the notable changes from year to year is they're planning to write a DNR forestry grant, one that would accomplish, and it's actually, I believe, been discussed at a previous meeting when we passed a resolution on it, and that was for a tree inventory across the city. It's commonplace that cities have a current tree inventory. Further, the emerald ash borer is really making its way around both street trees as well as private trees. And so that's an activity, as well as an increase in the amount of trees we'll be planting in the city next year. So those items are included in the urban forestry section of this budget.
I'm assuming cemetery propane is for winter burials?
I believe so. I wouldn't be the person to ask that, but I'm getting a nod from Tom back there. Spends a lot of time with Jeremy around
Just seemed
the
kind of a weird
office there.
category to have.
Yeah. City buildings. One of the notable changes here is in the first item in the salary section. We're proposing to take over the janitorial services here at City Hall, and then finding ways to do so off-site at other buildings, just to encourage and maintain the quality of the cleaning services. It's been difficult to both find a vendor or vendor alternatives to the cleaning, and this is something that I think will be met by both the public and city staff with, if we can make a placement. That's a difficult position given that it's limited hours and temp and all that.
So,
And potentially a cost savings. I would add that it's when we factor all the costs across the departments, it might be a little bit of a savings. So sorry, go ahead.
and that was kind of what I was alluding to, because it looks like your salary's going up by $8,000, but I know that's also probably some of Jeremy's salary. And then we're also increasing cleaning supplies by $500. So I mean, what are you taking out the quality of the service and reliability of service? What are we from a cost point? Maybe saving $500?
No, it's actually more considerable than that. And I know we've got the police department factored in there. We have some other cleaning services in streets. And so we've had active discussions about taking, either consolidating where we can or fitting those cleaning services together. Frankly, Victory Janitorial has been unreliable. So even if we paid them more than what we paid a custodian, having somebody actually clean would be desired. So even if it's not a full-on cost savings.
What would be the contingency if said employee goes on medical leave, LOA, or quits?
For the contingency, the mayor is going to clean the bathrooms in City Hall.
I want to revise my personal budget then.
Like any other, we probably have to call back a temp service. There are some options too to using a temp agency for that, but passing a background check has been increasingly difficult to find people that can do that, both for PD and frankly for City Hall. So we want to have a little more control over that service. And I don't want to put Rachel on the spot, but if you had any comments on the custodial placement and wage aspect, and I can go into our details if we need to go there, but does anybody desire further clarification on the custodian aspect? It's kind of up in the air. I mean, if we spend it in salaries or we spend it in the contract services, that's remains to be seen. I think we're good. Gerald, if I could have your microphone.
The line for building repair and maintenance, is this all of our buildings?
No, it's largely City Hall, but City Hall isn't getting any, like the rest of us, not getting any younger. So it's always a question. I mean, when the elevator went out, we dipped into some borrowing reserves. That's generally where we're covering our capital improvements from, is the borrowing. But you find more of your routine maintenance, that type of thing.
So the other buildings show up in other parts of the budget?
That's right. Yeah, generally within their own departments, there's a line item, unless again it's a big capital item. We did the fire department boiler, I believe, and that was a borrowing item. It couldn't fit in their operating budget. Yeah.
The other thing to factor in too is since this switched over to LED, quantity of light bulbs bought per year should be way down to nothing in theory. So some of the routine repair of the building has been cut out by efficiency.
I just wondered if we're getting into, that doesn't seem like very much to me for the size of the building and all.
Nope.
Are we getting into some deferred maintenance problems one of these years that we're not budgeting for?
I wouldn't say deferred maintenance. I would say more stuff like the carpeting in this room, kind of stuff like that. But I would say our boilers aren't that old. Mm-hmm. For the most part, the building's solid, minus being 100 years old. It's more the cosmetic, paint, carpeting, drapes, not from 40 years ago kind of stuff. What about the drapes? So, but, that kind of stuff is probably what's gaining on us, but it's not crucial to the operation of this building.
Tom Barnett.
Can you explain general government and why that went down a little bit?
General in the 51.
Yeah.
So that's where that shows the funding source. So that comes from the property tax levy, or from other income sources, but generally that's tagged to the general government category. So that's, if you look up, that's the budget for each of those years. And
it's just based on the cost of operating said building.
The true numbers are above. So is your question, why are we budgeting less this next year than we did this year? Because of the corresponding amounts above. Okay. So there had been, and I think that's kind of was getting to the mayor's point that overall, even with these changes, we're requesting less money for the city buildings than we budgeted this year.
For the that description at the bottom, it tells you which categories that you actually approve the budget at the grand total, and this budget would be included in the general government, and then it flows onto the summary page that we'll show to you in later meetings after we have more information that we're waiting on.
Playground equipment, projecting that there'll be a couple of capital projects this year. As we continue to talk about Pioneer Park improvements, as well as other maintenance projects that Jeremy has planned around in the park system, that we actually will have a playground, at least one playground equipment project. And he has you'll see in the bottom left corner, a fund balance that he's been carrying. And so he carries that, and then when he has enough saved up or there's a grant that comes in, then we make that investment happen. So $75,000 is being budgeted for machinery and equipment, so that could be one fairly large playground. It could be split up into various projects, but namely the Pioneer Park improvements is what he's planning for next year, and that we would apply for some grant funding or include that as part of the community funding or fund solicitation that we would do for the skate park, splash pad, and any other Pioneer Park improvements.
This is more just of an operation. Why isn't this just not part of the park's budget versus being its own category?
The segregation of funds, yeah, that's kind of a philosophical thing, but there's maybe good reason why this one, I'm not sure if there was a reason why they created this one specifically.
'Cause I mean, all this could just be line items in parks in my mind.
Well, it could, but then you're not going to carry a fund balance.
Oh, true. Good
Then
point.
it's all going to just go back to the general fund, but we have some activities that are specific to the shelter reservation fees are going in there. I was going to say that the transfer in of that 75,000, that is going to be coming from our 23 borrowing, once we get to that, if that works out.
The next one is the boat launch, again segregated, and I guess again for the same reason Wendy just indicated for the playground equipment. That carries a fund balance, and that's another good one to segregate because of the boat launch fees. I think generally the public expects those things that they're paying to go purely for the improvement, or at least to underwrite some of the costs for improving and maintaining the boat launches in the city. We did put in there $10,000 for professional services. There is a state recreational boating grant that we can apply for up to $250,000. Would be a cost share with the city. We continue to get feedback that the heavily used launch at Hodag Park could use at some point some improvements. So the DNR actually reached out because of that boat landing. All the stormwater runs right into the lake, and so they, would encourage us and probably score very highly to deal with the stormwater management in that particular landing. I don't know if 10,000 will be enough, but at least it'll get a scope underway for some engineering and design. You can't apply for the grant without some form of engineering and design. In any case, it carries a fund balance, so the council could easily determine to approve whoever it is at that point to do that work and have a funding source for it.
Based on some complaints earlier in the year, it sounded like we raised our fees for boat launch going into this fiscal or this season.
Yep.
So are we projecting less use based on the budget being the same, or just we don't have enough data to accurately see what we get for a revenue source?
It's definitely the data point, and the other conversation we've had with the clerk's office is finding a way to be able to take credit card payments or online payments at the boat launches. So that would increase that number, though we just conservatively budgeted the same amount. We could bump it up to $7,000, $7,500 based upon 2020 and 2021 numbers, but I think until we get the online payments, again, for the same reasons I argue that people are carrying less cash if they're using it at the launch, or they're just not coming to City Hall to get their permits.
And forgive me because I haven't launched a boat in the city of Rhinelander ever. Is this like a yearly pass, seasonal pass, daily pass?
We have both the daily and annual passes, both, and we started charging residents this year. That's the other new charge.
Is that projected to be tied into our new city website for they could pay right on the website if they're coming up here on vacation?
Yeah, we should be able to even launch it. I mean, not that this is the time of year necessarily to launch that new, but yes,
Makes
that
a good Christmas gift.
It should, yeah, right. It should capitalize on some additional revenue.
I have a question. So when you're saying that they can pay for it right at the launch, are you speaking 100% online or like a kiosk, or what are you envisioning?
More like an app.
Yeah, I would say an app, because I think about how we all get DNR deer hunting licenses on your phone now, right? That you could easily prove that you paid for that launch and make the cash But we did have that conversation with the new deputy clerk. Amount of paperwork associated with boat launch passes is quite exorbitant for something that could be a lot less touch.
And I think having the ability to pay through an app or online would be helpful, because there's a lot of times where people don't have that much cash and will empty out their entire change thing in their vehicle, just saying like, hey, I'm paying as much as I can, but I don't have any means because I don't have the cash with me, so it would be beneficial that way. So I'm not opening envelopes full of quarters and nickels.
Or Walmart shopping bags, right? Like the dump sites, yeah. All right. Perpetual care fund, pretty straightforward. Hard to project how many cemetery plots we're going to sell or how many we have left, but maintaining this fund balance is important, as well as because of state statutes around how these cemeteries have to be operated. If they're not operated by a third party, but operated by the city.
So just based on the age of the cemetery, do we put ourselves in a weird spot in the future if said cemetery is full? Do we have to acquire more land for such use, or?
I don't believe we have. We certainly don't have a plan to acquire additional land, and I don't believe there's a requirement at all. But to perpetually maintain and care for it. Yep.
I was just thinking from if we're at, let's say, 90% occupant.
Yeah.
That could be a substantial cost potentially.
Yeah. I think some cities probably invest. I mean, depends on the landscape of the community with denominational cemeteries and those that might be available to the public. So. Police department, we'll have Lloyd just come up if there's questions for him, but we have an unsettled contract, so the salaries aspect will not be fully settled and fleshed out until we negotiate a settlement. So hopefully, I understand there's maybe something coming our way on that regard, but we'll talk more about that as we go in closed session in the future. Lloyd is, very diligent overall in this budget, and I think from an overtime perspective, we candidly talk about that all the time, that, if there's an overage in overtime, it's probably going to come with a reduction in salaries, but when you've got FMLA instances and other activities with officers being out, we want to maintain certain staffing levels, and that comes with a cost. I guess those would be a couple of comments I have. Later in the budget, and when we do meet with department heads, we spend a fair amount of time talking line by line, because we want to make sure the projected is showing fairly accurately in terms of what's being budgeted. We don't want department heads to ever feel like they can or should go over budget, and I think we owe them all a testament to maintaining that. But you'll see that in the projected, there is somewhat of a differential. In the past, we've done a transfer in the case of the police department for body-worn cameras and dash cams. We did a small transfer of what was contingency or leftover in previous years. But vehicle rotation, I guess, would be the other point I would make in the case of the police department. And then just routine inflationary, I haven't used the word yet tonight, but inflationary costs across our budget is something we're contending with, and the reality is that it's only what we can project and nothing more than that. Any questions for Lloyd?
Actually, a question for Wendy. What's the average cost of a new police officer from a salary point of view? Sorry to put you on the spot. I mean, rough number.
What's the starting? What's the starting hourly? Do you know that, Lloyd, off the top of your head?
For
25?
step one, it's $29 an hour.
So
Times
75,000.
So if we were to hire one more police officer, what do you think your overtime would drop by?
It would be significant.
Roughly the cost of a new police officer, or more or less?
I don't know if it would be a full 75,000. When we get to the point of being fully staffed, I think that the current overtime amount is probably higher than what it would need to be, but I haven't yet to experience that luxury of being fully staffed with
never
FMLA, people deciding that they want a different career. We had a couple people do that over the last couple of years, or choose to go to a different department because they want something with more opportunities than a small town police department. But the last couple of hires that we've hired, where we've invested in them with the Nicolay Area Technical College, and or one employee we sent to Green Bay. They seem to be very committed to the community, and I don't see a turnover with them. So I think that stability is going to be there. We just got to get those slots filled. And our latest opening will be filled. He graduates from academy 4 weeks from Friday. I just talked to him tonight, and he's pretty excited. But then it's, 14 weeks of training. So we hire that employee in April. They go to school in May, and then they graduate in October, and then they go through field training, and they graduate field training in February if they were on task, maybe later, earlier, depending on how good they are. So it's almost a full year before we see the full realization of that, fulfilling a permanent vacancy.
So hypothetically, if we were to hire one more, would you need any kind of additional police vehicles, equipment such as that? Or one more would be pretty much, you have the equipment to handle one more employee?
No, we have the same, staffing-wise, we're at 17 sworn police officers. And in 2020, when I did my budget presentation, I showed you an article from the Rhinelander Daily News back in the day that said as of January 1st, 1969, we'd be at 17 sworn. Population is a little bit more, but what Rhinelander offers as services for being the county seat has grown a lot since 1969. So, but we have the capacity. At one point, we had 21 sworn with the same number of vehicles. So I don't think it would be additional cost of vehicles and stuff like that. It would be the additional cost of obviously the salary, the insurance, and the things that come along with that.
So from a rough point of view, it would be additional hit of 30 to 35,000 roughly for additional employee based on the reduction of overtime. That sounds about right.
That could be something that we could.
Sounds like a hell of a deal for one more police officer.
Yeah, at one point we had four crews of 4. Now we have 4 crews of 3. We haven't filled. In the 90s, there was cop grants where the federal government was giving money for multiple years. And then as those years went through, the city requirement was to pick up more and more of the actual true cost of that employee. And to offset that, when we had a retirement, the city just wouldn't replace that retirement. So we went from growing to 21 and then reduced it back to 17 over those years.
I mean, the reason why I bring it up is I would argue since 1969, the city has grown quite a bit from a square feet, square mile, however you want to rate it. And I mean, we already brought in another 500 acres of land since I've been here. So if there's additional cost savings and overtime, it might make sense to increase, the amount of officers by 1.
The calls for service that we do have are lengthy. When we have a mental health commitment, we're at Aspirus for hours. And then if typically they can't be housed there because they don't have a facility in their human support unit, so we're driving that person to Green Bay, to Oshkosh, and we can't leave the city unprotected, so we have to call staff in to drive that person to a location outside the city. So we have to backfill the city to make sure. We do utilize and work well with the sheriff's department at times, but our primary enforcement is the city. An OWIRS can take hours. A domestic violence can take hours. There's paperwork attached to every single thing that we do. And more of our job is I'm sitting on more and more committees. I can't make them all some of the time. Dementia, hoarding, mental health. There's a lot of different things that the community is looking at from different perspectives that's going to require more of our time and more services for us. Not to maybe act as a official law enforcement officer, but as a social service type of role in assisting the medics with a dementia patient or assisting somebody with hoarding, the code enforcement, the citation writing, the paperwork, the court time. So there's certainly a demand on our services, and when someone takes vacation, we're automatically at minimum staffing of 2 people, and then you have a domestic or a drunk driver, then that leaves maybe just 1 officer on the road.
From a salary point of view, and this might actually get into the overtime question again, how much do you think that is a burden based on community events that we don't charge for?
The community events we have are at summertime and they're spread out. So the real one, like we didn't staff Project North this year. We did, the first year that it was here, I actually worked it. I found that the need was not there for additional services. Sometimes we rolled the dice. This year we didn't fund or didn't staff Oktoberfest. The year before we did. So those are some of the things that we chose internally to save on overtime, because we looked at what the calls for service were during the previous event and didn't warrant us having additional staff on. But then we got caught in the trick bag one year where we did have a event, the all-school reunion, where they did authorize additional officers, and those 2 additional officers could not cover the calls for service that resulted downtown with that many people consuming intoxicants to wee hours in the morning. So we had to up that staff, but that is something that's reimbursed by the event. So, but Chalk Fest, the other events, there's a little bit requirement of us, but nothing that is undue to our services.
So it sounds like this last, year 2022, the amount of overtime/payroll for special events has gone down. Thus, the category of overtime is more based on a need in the community that's not special events, correct?
With one caveat, this is the first year, probably in many years, that we fully staffed the 4th of July parade, and there is no funding other than my overtime budget. Looking at, obviously my job is public safety, the safety of the community, and there's no bigger event in our community than our 4th of July parade. And seeing what happened in Waukesha and different things, I don't think it was, would be good for, it would not have been a wise choice of me not to have all my staff working that day. What the possibilities, who knows? So obviously you saw that we had city equipment at certain key intersections to help the possibility of not having something traumatic happen. So that was the one day that the whole police department worked. And obviously that was a very expensive day on my overtime budget.
Thank you. Oh, Mr. Anderson.
Yeah. The line for fuel, grease, and oil jumped up this year and plan to go down next year. Can you explain that?
Well, we actually increased the budget for next year. I can tell you that when I got my Quick Trip bill last week, we were officially not going the right way in our fuel economy. When we budgeted, we did not budget for $4.50 to $4.60 a gallon that it was for a while. So we are projecting a loss in that line item just because of the increased fuel cost. So along with that, oil is a little bit more expensive. So we did raise that a little bit for next year. Hopefully, we're also hopeful that the gas prices will continue to decline.
So you think you're raising it enough?
Well, it's a crapshoot.
Okay.
You know, that when you're fully staffed, you have more squads on the road, so there's more fuel being used. So there's, you know, we pay overtime because we're short on staff, but we don't have more staff driving more cars, resulting in more use of fuel. So, yeah, I guess, you know, you have to look for the silver lining somewhere.
Also, the line item for building repair and maintenance, you have $3,000. What does that cover?
Well, not much this year. I think we got like $14 left for the rest of the year. And our building got struck by lightning, and one of our garage doors was the motor was destroyed. We had to have that replaced. So that is a crapshoot every year. Our building's older and older, so we hope that we don't lose a air conditioner or a boiler. Or the one concern I do have that we have not addressed is when the building was built in 1976, they put space heaters in the front lobby area and in the 2 public restrooms. They are no longer functioning. So when we get below zero, those areas of the department get extremely cold. Unfortunate, and it's a concern of mine because our front door is open 24 hours a day, but then the inner door is locked. So you have a vestibule area where people can contact the dispatch center. Well, we've had people that were in there that were passed out, sleeping there for the night when it's extremely cold, and I'm concerned about the possibility of someone having a serious medical issue because it's not heated very well in that area. So that's something that we have to address sooner than later. so that we don't have any unfortunate, we could have a pipe freeze. One of the things that we do to help inside is prop open the 2 bathrooms in the public area so that the heat that's in the lobby does get into those bathrooms, especially on weekends when there's not much traffic. There's no traffic in our lobby at all. So that's an area of concern, and it's hard to address that when you have 3,000 and you don't know what's going to happen throughout the year.
Yeah, have you done any or gotten any estimates on what it would cost to fix the things you're talking about?
Yes, we had actually the one company that came in looked down and laughed at us and said there's absolutely nothing we can do with those. Those are so archaic. There's no way you're going to get those space heaters to work again. So they'd have to come up with an alternative, and they never did. I don't think they felt it was going to be serious enough looked at to even offer a true estimate.
Are you aware of any other impending deferred maintenance issues with the building?
Not that I'm aware of. Historically we had a water leak. We addressed that finally. It's something I inherited as a chief. I don't know why it wasn't addressed sooner, but we finally got that addressed. And it seems like we had good maintenance now on our air conditioners. This is the first summer where we had 0 issues with that. Otherwise, that was $1,000 typically every summer of something going wrong with them. So that's just, you start January 1 and you see where you end up on December 31st, and you hope for the best.
And I don't know who to actually direct this question to, but why are we budgeting no contingency this year?
So the contingency lines are something that we kind of fill in after we have everything compiled together, and that's after we know what our revenues are, what our expenditure restraint limit is, what our levy limits are. So that would be something we'd address after everything's compiled.
Okay.
And that contingency that's on for this year is something that I'm also going to require to fill, and I have a funding source for that.
Cool.
And that's directed towards the body cams and squad cams.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd. Next one is K9, pretty self-explanatory and straightforward, though the vehicle is listed there, and it's Lloyd's. Well, I'll let you speak since you're at the podium.
Yes. We accepted a second K9 several years ago with the understanding that it was going to be a fully funded program, and the funding source from the donor did not come through with that. We got the dog and some pieces of equipment, but we didn't get the more expensive piece of equipment, which is a squad. So we've been utilizing a 2013 Dodge Ram pickup truck. The problem that you have is the height in which the dog has to continue every day in and day out. Every time it gets out of the truck, gets in the truck, it has to jump that much higher. So on dogs, especially law enforcement canine, their hips are the first to go. So we're looking at doing a public campaign to look for donations to replace that 10-year-old vehicle with a lower riding SUV. Because we are a small department, we're at minimum staffing, the back seat has to be 60-40. The canine can't have the whole back seat because we have to be able to transport people when we arrest them, or we have to transport them somewhere, because you can't, if you're going to have a squad, you have to have a fully functioning squad, and part of that is transporting people and inmates. So we're going to go public with that and try to start a fundraising drive to get a new SUV for that. For poor Jason, who has to jump so high.
How much do you anticipate that you need for that?
Well, it depends where the prices keep going with vehicles. Minimum $40,000 for SUV.
So based on, I know you guys take quite a lot of pride in saying the K9 unit is, self-sufficient. Are you asking this more as a city contribution, more of a city extending a line of credit to the program?
The K9 program historically has been completely separated from the tax roll. So there's not been one single penny that the city has, that I'm aware of, that has been out of the general fund towards the K9. We do fundraising events that we put into a K9, as you're looking at the K9 fund, but that's all donations from the community, from different events. So this would be I'm not asking for the city, because I also, as you saw my big budget, I'm asking for a vehicle there. So it would be hard for me to come forward and asking for 2 vehicles. So that's why we tell our canine handlers, your program, but you have to put the time and effort into fundraise to make the program durable, sustainable, and it meets the needs of the canines.
Do we always have plans to have 2 canines in the future, or is this kind of more fell in our lap, we couldn't say no?
It was, it was kind of a political yes, based upon where the dog came from and who was the city administrator at the time. So typically we would fund just 1 canine, because there's additional behind the scenes cost with federal law when it comes to dog care. The canine officers have to be paid under federal law for taking care of a dog because it lives with them. So there's other benefits that we have to pay on the backside to the officers with time off and schedule that into our schedule without causing overtime for additional cost. So
Do we have a rough estimate of how much longer we may have 2 canines based on their age?
boy, it's hard to say. A good dog might go 7-10 years, and we're into, I think, 4 and 3. So 3 to 4 years, maybe 5 years. Odin's a bigger dog, so the wear and tear on him is a lot more harder than Jason, who's a smaller frame dog. But it, you know, they get used, and they train all the time. They can get injured. Currently, Odin's injured. He's going to be off of work for 6 weeks. Good thing that doesn't count towards my workman's comp.
Well, overtime either, I suppose.
Yeah. So he's injured with a shoulder injury, just occurred at training. So, you know, every time the dog gets out to do something, there's an opportunity, a chance for them to get hurt to the injury to the extent where they can't work anymore.
Well, the only reason I ask is this might be an opportunity for more of a lease type option versus buying. If we may only need this additional vehicle for 3 to 4 years, lease might be a better option than just buying it outright,
It could be.
you know.
Mhm.
And DARE, you'll find that the program has been sort of suspended maybe, or is just kind of in limbo as of now based upon other priorities in that, but go ahead.
Yeah, to teach DARE, you have to have a DARE certified officer. We lost that person, went to a different agency, and is no longer a sworn officer. They went to a different job within law enforcement, but not a sworn officer. So we don't currently have anybody that's certified in DARE. To do that, you have to leave the state to do that. It's free, but there's still it comes back to being fully staffed to be able to do some of those things. Is there a desire? We serve Zion and Nativity, and those 2 schools are our primary enforcement. The K-12 has a contract with the sheriff's office, so if we did DARE at Zion. Now Nativity is now asking us for some type of program. We do have different resources that we could utilize. They just want to see us in the school. They want the kids to develop relationships with the officers, and that was the fundamental reason for DARE. Depending on what study you see, you read it as to how effective the DARE program was. The effectiveness was in the relationship building, understanding that as kids grow up, they can trust law enforcement. They build those relationships. They're in classrooms with them. They go outside, play at recess, and the kids learn that they can trust them. So when they get older, if they have a difficult thing, they can come to that officer and have a conversation. And it might not be about drugs, might be something going on in their personal life. So it's about building that community trust and that relationship. Drug education is ongoing, and you can argue whether it's effective or not effective. It's been going on since the 80s, since Remember Say No with Nancy Reagan. So, but it's certainly something that we're going to have to make a decision at some point. It can't sit dormant forever as to how we're going to utilize those funds.
Great. Thanks, Lloyd. Move into streets portion. Our streets and water foreman, Tom is here and can come forward, as well as Randy, Public Works Director. Going to go to some general notations, as has been the theme as it relates to inflationary and operational costs. Certainly making our best guesstimate as to what fuel and operating costs might be. You'll find As far as other increases over previous years, specific to, let me just get to my point here. Electricity costs have consistently exceeded budget, though we've looked at being more consistent with the way we're tagging the electricity costs throughout the streets department. I'll move down to, where was it here? Building repair and maintenance, as has been discussed in other instances, there's constant need for minor repair to occur that wouldn't rise to a capital investment at all. The travel and training under 331, the code on the left, you'll see a increase twofold. We've got new staff, both at the leadership level as well as throughout the department that might be afforded training opportunities, and so we want to make sure that they've got that opportunity available to them. And we've talked through details, as we do in all the departments, on the travel and training aspect to ensure that departments are identifying what those are, as opposed to just throwing an allocation and figuring it out later. Um, 373 sidewalks repair. We've got a note there, potentially exploring a resident repair program. I don't know, Mayor, if there's anything you want to speak to specific to that.
Sure. So we're exploring the concept if someone wants their sidewalks repaired in front of their house due to damage, that we would do like a 50-50 program where they would pay for half the cost. We, come up with the other half and take care of the whole project for them. I've seen it done in multiple other communities. It's kind of a throw it at the wall and see how many takers we have. I could see some people saying, I don't want a sidewalk, I'm not interested. I could see some people jumping on it based on what have you. The caveat with this program is, a good example was someone living on Timber Drive who's being redone next year. We're not going to help them replace their sidewalk when we're going to bulldoze it next year. So that's kind of part of this, is working with them. This could also be, we have multiple blocks in our city where the sidewalk stops mid-lot or at one lot and not continue. So this could be a way if someone wants a sidewalk in front of their house to help, make that happen. So it's kind of just throw it on the wall and see what happens for 1 year. It might be something we're way over budget or way under budget. The perk with this is we could cap it saying, here's the funds we have available. When they're gone, and then next year address as we see fit.
Snow and ice control, the salt and sand, there's some nuances with the way we budget for that, but operationally continuing to explore how the brine and salt sand mix with new leadership there. I'm sure there'll be continued discussion about how that continues to be rolled out.
I'm assuming the salary is based on not having a whole mechanic. Is the main
You're
increase.
specific to the
Street maintenance, or why is there a 50,000 difference in
give
salary?
me your numbers there again.
Are you looking at the street maintenance salary?
Correct, street maintenance, the first line item.
Oh, up at the top.
Or is that just based on pay increase and?
So I do believe that I did update for our new mechanic coming on with
Okay.
the information that we have.
Cool.
Any questions on streets within Public Works? Tom, anything more to add at this time?
Now that we've got a director of public works, some of those allocations will come out of streets. And we are full staff now, and for the most part, as far as I can remember, that hasn't been fully staffed over at the street department.
Good stuff. Recycling is the next page. This is a segregated fund again because we've got a grant fund. The state operates a recycling grant fund, and we have to allocate and track the costs associated with that program in order for the grant. I don't think there's really anything other than the professional services is the city's long-term contract with Republic Services, formerly Eagle Waste, accounts for a 3% cost increase annually.
Mr. Barnett?
Can you explain the transfer from general fund and the increase? I'm not sure what that means.
Sure. So we account for the second part of that page is all, below the space is all the expenses associated with recycling. So that includes the salaries aspect would be like brush and leaf pickup, I believe, to the extent that the grant allows for reimbursement. And then we transfer in, because that fund doesn't have we don't like charge a recycling fee. Some places do charge a recycling fee. If we did that, we could have this fully segregated, but because we have to fund it we have to fund the costs, the balance of the grant, which is only 22,000. The balance has to come from the general fund tax levy. Parking lot advisory. This is a segregated fund that we're proposing to no longer keep segregated. We'll keep seeing it because you'll have the historical numbers on the budget, but decided to roll it right into the general fund. On the one hand, it's good to keep segregated because, you know, we've got parking permits and the cell tower lease, and we've got a funding source for parking lot maintenance. But at the same time, you know, there's one more fund that we maintain. And previously, Downtown Rhinelander, Inc. and the Cleary Foundation had funded aspects of this through agreements, but neither of those entities exist. So to keep it segregated is really not necessary anymore, unless Wendy has any further comments on that.
No, and I was just going to add that you can see historically the rent that we've received from the parking lot cell tower lease is about what we have left of the fund balance. So in my opinion, the previous contributions have been spent down, that this is just rental income that we have sitting in there.
We're not proposing to add parking meters or charging for parking, but, you know, like we've talked with other aspects of operations, that could be something the city could entertain. Pratt, Premier Resort Area Tax. There's a number of aspects to this budget. On the revenue side, the first section at the top, we're conservatively projecting the same amount of revenues that we are projected to receive the balance of this calendar year. Obviously, the actual will still flow into this fund because it's a segregated account. The state transportation grant, we did not receive that grant because we did not complete the Timber Drive project this year. It's a two-part project. So we're moving that $450,000 grant to 2023. And then moving into the expense side of things, if you look at the projected column of the street maintenance, 816, I guess they're all 816 in that area. But the street maintenance aspect of that, $750,000 is what our projected is for this year. As we determined that we weren't going to be doing all of Timber Drive, we knew that we were going to have a surplus of unspent funds. And so as you got to see all those projects come before council, that's the actual amount we're going to be spending on mill and overlays, chip seals, concrete curb and gutter, work across various streets within the city. And then the next line is the actual projected of what the Timber Drive Phase 1 project will cost. We obviously had budgeted a much higher amount for that, but we're not going to be doing the entirety of that project this year. If you carry that over to the 2023 request, at this time we're proposing to spend $500,000 again in the chip seal concrete mill and overlay category, though final details as to which streets, the quantities, and all of that are not worked out and won't be until that gets closer to being put to bid. But at a minimum, allocating $500,000 again. As you can see, though, this remains fairly dynamic in terms of what actually may happen depending on your all decision and staff's recommendations therein. Timber Drive street improvement, we're proposing to spend $900,000 in 2023. That'll be the street portion of Phase 2. The utilities will be carrying the other sanitary sewer, stormwater, and water aspects of the project. So those will be buried in the other budgets that you'll basically pulling it out of the cash reserves that those budgets carry. Moving back to the projected Olson Lane, we're proposing or projecting that 175,000 of that portion of the street costs will be pulled from the Pratt, and then the rest is debt service beyond that. I'll draw your attention to the bottom left corner. That's the fund balance projections. If we account for what we are actually going to spend this year, as well as the proposal or the proposed revenues for next year, we'll have an ending balance of only $376,000 in that fund. That provides for additional road projects, not a whole lot more. Certainly if the fund balance grow, or if the revenues grow based upon the consumer spending in Rhinelander, then that fund will do better. But conservatively and as close to accurately, that's what we're projecting. Bike ped advisory, you'll see in there in two instances in the to the right of that fund balance projections, we do track the non-motorized transportation aspect of it. That's 10% of what the Pratt accrues, and slightly above that, the bottom right, $318,000 is what the city's portion of the trail is expected to cost. There's been information about the grant, and we'll share that separately, but that's what the city's portion will be. Questions from anyone on the Pratt, or feedback from staff if there's anything more on that?
And part of the reason why we are kind of conservative with this number is, even though we do have a couple more businesses coming online, we're also concerned if we're in a bell from COVID, where we might see less vacationers coming to our town as we get back to norm. So that's why we decided to be more conservative with revenue versus optimistic. Just we're in that bell graph of higher boom of vacationers. And besides, more money's never a problem from an income point of view.
Yeah. Fund 444 bike ped picks up some more of the items we just talked about. We've got a grant request in for the first item for the trail at Timber Drive. The discussion we touched on at the last council meeting, which is the bike pedestrian donations for the Heel Creek, that tentative commitments and fund solicitation for $500,000 in donations. So we just budgeted for or accounted for it there as a segregated fund for that purpose. And then from the debt service, that we currently just have $100,000 earmarked for in the borrowing for Heel Creek improvements, though that's really just a placeholder at this time. Any questions on bike ped? So we'll move into water utility. On the revenue side, projecting pretty similar revenues to what we budgeted for this current calendar year. There's been some fluctuations up and down in various classifications or categories of service, but it's pretty straightforward. I would acknowledge, and I have kind of started a running list of future tasks or topics and actions by the council. This fund, if you recall, is completely regulated by the Public Service Commission, so any sort of rate increases, we have to get their authority and approval. We did a simplified rate case 2 years ago, which was about 3% of an adjustment. It's my recommendation that we look at doing some form of rate case next year, whether it's just a simplified rate case or looking to do a full rate case. A full rate case would come with many benefits in that we could take a look at a number of our policies and the language at which we operate our water utility. And so, but that is a fairly elaborate process with the Public Service Commission and would take months, if not almost a year, to accomplish. So it wouldn't take effect probably until mid-year. So one of the concerns I have is ensuring that our cash balance will carry all the costs that we're projecting in the Timber Drive project, Oneida area, which is also baked into the utilities as a funding source, which is why you didn't see the Pratt having anything to do with the Courthouse Oneida area project, because it's all contained within the utilities. Moving from the revenues to the expenditure side, there's obviously a lot of cost accounting there based upon our regulations of that utility. Staffing levels are still projected to be the same. So you see salaries kind of baked in a number of areas. Pretty straightforward budget, though, in terms of capital maintenance, capital reconstruction, that type of thing. But the key there is just to, again, watch for, paying attention to make sure our revenues are covering our capital investments.
If I'm not mistaken, aren't we required by the state to have a certain cash balance in that at all times?
Yeah, that answer also carries more so in the wastewater utility, depending on what our funding sources for previous borrowing and capital. There are DNR expectations or loan obligations that we carry a certain fund balance to maintain the infrastructure that we're either replacing or using other people's money essentially with that expectation. Yeah.
Do we have a rough number for the two categories?
So if you would like to, you can go back to one of our previous month's financials. If you look at the balance sheet for the water and the wastewater, it's actually separated out by each account, by each funding loan that we have out there. We have a reserve account, and all the reserve accounts are actually held in a separate bank account.
Okay.
But we have it set up.
Yeah, the only reason I'm questioning is, it shows we might have a 11.2 million on hand, but how
That
much?
also includes the assets, so the
Oh,
infrastructure.
okay.
That's not cash.
Okay, makes sense.
Going to wastewater. This one is not regulated by the Public Service Commission, so purely at council's authority, gets to make decisions regarding operations, revenues, that type of thing. This would be an item that we did not do a rate increase last year, but we should look at doing some sort of cost or CPI, Consumer Price Index adjustment for the same reasons. More infrastructure we're reinvesting in, the more costly our or the draw on our cash occurs, and so we need to maintain certain sufficient revenues for the operation, but also to meet the debt obligations, debt service. So conservatively budgeting the revenue side of that for next year, not accounting for any increase, but making sure our operations are within there and consistent. From a wastewater standpoint, there are a couple of notations I'll make regarding increases over previous years, or at least the current fiscal year. Let me go down to was it the collection system pump? 833, maintenance of treatment plant equipment. The plant is annually reaching more of an age state, and as we encounter end of life for controls and various operating components, they're projecting additional need for cash to maintain some of the systems that are operating the plant. I've talked to Randy about outlining what those are, just to be more prescriptive as to what their staff is going to be working on from a capital standpoint. And of course, those things will have to come back through council. Given the amount of expenditure, it's likely that they would be a capital investment, but in some cases, maybe they won't be. So it depends on if they're capital pumps and major equipment. There's also, as a plant ages, we should be identifying additional external funding sources for upgrading things like the communication system, what's called the SCADA system there. There's a lot of state funding or federal funding that could potentially, because that's going to be a very, very, very expensive endeavor that our ratepayers really shouldn't be shouldered with, especially if there's some alternatives for funding outside the organization. Trying to think if there's any other notations. Randy, is there anything more, Wendy, that we covered this afternoon when we met on this budget?
No, the only thing I was going to just mention was when we do capital improvements, you're not going to see it flow through this sheet. This is mirroring the income statement. The capital improvements are recorded on the balance sheet.
I would just point out, Zach, the treatment plant I have found is very beautiful. You have a Cadillac of a treatment plant. I was very impressed. Structurally, it's very sound. It is, if I continue to use that analogy of a Cadillac, though, entering a period now where maintenance is going to start coming up mechanically. And because you have a Cadillac, you're going to start having to look at Cadillac prices for parts. But most of the next year's projected repairs are going to be more pumps and mechanics such as that. So,
Any other questions, wastewater or water utility?
And this might not be something we know the answer to. How are we with that plan from a capability or capacity point of view? Are we getting close to maximum flows, or is that something we have room for with additional developments?
I would say we have capacity at the plant, though, we don't have industrial service agreements with users who are consuming a non-residential capacity of the plant. So that could be something to explore, would be getting capacity commitments from the industrial users. I would say from my perspective, operationally, not from a public works so much as I fear more about the capacity of some of our collection system and the lack of service area, or the areas that we currently don't provide service to in the city. I mean, those should be remain priorities for us to connect to the water and sewer utility. So in the case of Olson Lane, right, we've got a number of parcels in there that are in the city, all on private water and sewer, or many of them. We run water a lot in the winter, and we just had a conversation about this too, that, if people are running water and they're connected to water but not to sewer, they're getting a disproportionate benefit, than if they were running it through the collection system. So I think there's other concerns, not so much at the treatment plant, but more so in the collection system, the capacity of the collection system and the age. And I think the age of the collection system is why we're doing big project areas, why we qualify for big $3 million funding sources, because it's a high need for us. So staying on top of that 5-year capital plan, doing areas like the Highview Parkway, Hillendale, Maple, Balsam, those parts of town in the future are going to be really key to making sure really the operation of the system is sound versus, I believe, granted, the age of the plant is going to be something that will continue to be a cost. So
if we were to add 15% of byproduct going to the plant, would it be able to keep up?
Residential strength waste, I believe there's no issue. It's if we had a user that was maybe a dairy or a brewery type or some of those other high strength wastes, that would be an issue for the plant, at least from my perspective. Again, I look to staff if they have any other feedback. But household strength waste, it shouldn't have any issue. Stormwater utility, the final utility of the three. This is one we've talked about in the past, that our rates are considerably lower than many other like municipalities, either regionally or across the state. It's a newer utility in that we haven't historically, we haven't had it for a long time, and so therefore our rates haven't gone up to meet the maintenance needs of the collection system that we operate. The fund balance on the bottom left corner is misleading in that this fund is actually in a deficit state and from a financial standpoint, it always gets corrected on the balance sheets, but we should look at a rate increase here as well, at least on a every other year basis, and modest, small increases that can be weathered by residents and the business community. It's also one that also achieves revenue from non-tax-paying entities. So the utilities are an equitable way for, on a user basis, for non-tax-paying entities to be contributing to the operation and the maintenance of our utilities.
Mr. Anderson?
Is it fair to say that we should be looking at these rate increases you've mentioned in the near future?
Yeah, I think we should make as many of them effective January 1st as possible. Certainly the wastewater and the stormwater rate. The water one will require some additional consideration that I think we need to make a determination if we're going to do simplified rate case, which would be just a rate adjustment, or to do the full rate case, which could take months. With new staff on board, we had some conversation about the full rate case today. We'll have to look at, that may require external resources. We could also look at the wastewater utility, and this is something probably more for long-term. I would just do a rate adjustment now, but long-term, to do a rate analysis that, in the same way of the equity in our property tax base, that our wastewater rates also should be equitable. That industrial, commercial, and other property property classes or rate classes are not disproportionate to residential. And I have no feeling of if there's inequities there, but at least to affirm that our rates in those classifications are appropriate. You just don't want one rate class to be subsidizing another, and that would be an easy fairly straightforward exercise in the case of the utilities. But that would require some external resources in the case of the rate study. And I'm thinking we're in the near-term horizon, like within the October cycle, to put the rate adjustments for stormwater and wastewater on the agenda. Yeah. A couple final comments talking about future inputs to the budget. Health insurance remains a wild card. We're currently out, while we affirmed the same broker, our current security health plan came back with an unreasonable increase. A 20% increase is something our budgets can't bear, and frankly, our plan performance shouldn't warrant a 20% increase, at least in our staff professional view. So Rachel's working with our broker to solicit market proposals, and as soon as we get that detail, we'll bring that item forward. I would suspect we're probably looking at either a no increase to maybe a 5 to a 7% would be somewhat reasonable, and probably what our budget can bear. Outside of that, I hope we don't have to make plan design changes to the health plans, and so we're going to run with not making any changes and just trying to get a renewal that would be more advantageous, cost effective, both to the employees as well as to the city, since the city operates primarily a no premium plan with a buy-up option. So that's health insurance.
I just wanted to add, right now we have a 10% increase built into the budget. But historically, we've been able to back that out after we get the final rates.
Yes.
Did we miss the fire?
This is only half of the budget.
Oh, okay. I was going to say.
Yep. Yeah, so this is half. We broke it into two due to, well, I'm already falling asleep based on lots of numbers. So having it in two different meetings we felt would be more adequate. And to be fair to the fire department for not sleeping during their presentation.
So next Monday we'll have another batch of budgets. The plan is then to present a summary at a subsequent meeting, and then your public hearing will be held sometime in November. We're going to publish the public hearing and run with one budget hearing, hopefully at that time, versus last year we had to run with two, and that was a little misstep. But I think we're all good. Everybody knows what they need to do this time around, so that's good. So that concludes the budget aspect. Do you want to go into? I guess
sure. So I would entertain a motion to go into closed session.
Or you go next week. If you don't want to go in tonight, but I think we should go tonight.
Pretty much.
Joe Peck motion to go into closed session pursuant to Wisconsin statute section 19.85 to consider the possible employment and compensation for the position of city administrator following the departure of the current city administrator. This will include the available data on hiring opportunities and the evaluation and discussion of potential candidates to carry out the duties of the position of city administrator. Keep going. All right. B, discuss and consider the sale or purchase of land pursuant Wisconsin statute 19.85 in order to preserve competitive bargaining purposes.
Anderson, second.
Not seeing any discussion. Clerk, take the roll call.
Stephen Jopek,
Aye.
David Holt, Leanne Felton,
Aye.
Tom Kelly,
Aye.
Gerald Anderson, Carrie Michalowski,
Aye.
Eileen Daniel, Thomas Barnett.
Aye. Aye.
Motion passes at 6:49, and we're going into closed session. closed session. Our next budget meeting will be September 26th at 5 p.m. Our next regular council meeting would be the same day at 6. So see you on the 26th at 5 p.m. Meeting adjourned.